Welcome to Lead Smarter, the podcast where you'll hear powerful, no-nonsense conversations about leadership with today's top experts and real-world leaders like yourself. Get the inside strategies, insights, and secrets they've learned on the journey to lead smarter. Let's dive in. On today's episode of Lead Smarter, we're diving into one of the most overlooked superpowers in leadership, the ability to have hard conversations that actually lead to change. My guest, Aleta Maxwell, knows this territory inside and out. She's a leadership coach, former chief HR officer, best-selling author, and the founder of Uplifting Leadership. Aleta scaled a company from 3 to 22 locations and helped lead a team of nearly 800, all while championing an employee-first servant leadership model that delivered results without burning people out. In this episode, we break down why leaders get stuck repeating the same conversations, how to stop assuming you're being clear when you're really just being loud, and the simple mindset shift that turns accountability into alignment. If you've ever felt like you're carrying the weight of your team or struggling to be both clear and kind, this one's for you. Let's get into it. Hey, Aleta, thank you for joining us on the Lead Smarter podcast. I've really enjoyed getting a chance to chat with you up to this point, learning about your background in leadership, books that you've written, which is a bestseller, by the way, very excited for you. And actually the topics of the book you wrote really does a great job, I think, of covering what I want to have a deeper conversation with you about. So I know if you could, maybe tell me a little bit and the listeners a little bit about your experience as a leader. I know you led teams of up to 700 people. And maybe kind of give us some insights onto how that inspired you to write your book that became a bestseller. Very interested in hearing that journey, and then we'd love to dive into some of those leadership topics that you covered.
Sure thing. Thank you so much for having me on today. My previous experience prior to going into executive coaching, I was a chief human resource officer of a restaurant group here in New York City called Dos Toros Taqueria. I joined them when they had 3 locations. Their entire goal was to grow to sell, but they were very, very clear as to they wanted to grow with a very, very healthy culture. They wanted to have an employee first mentality. So that's what we did. I spent 8 years with them growing the company from 3 locations up to 22 locations. We really focus on an entirely employee first culture and mentality. Throughout that time, I was working with a lot of leaders that for some reason were avoiding conversations. They were avoiding giving feedback. They were avoiding having kind of root cause conversations where they could see something was wrong with the employee. They didn't know what it was. Some of these managers would rush into the conversation to get it done. Some of them would avoid the conversation completely. And so a lot of my work with Dos Toros was kind of getting my feet wet into what makes a great leader, why are leaders sometimes great at difficult conversations, and what makes them great at difficult conversations, and really whetting my appetite on leadership. In 2020, we sold the company, which was our goal at the beginning of beginning of the year. And that allowed me to pivot. That allowed me to write my book. That allowed me to develop my online courses and dive into coaching. The reason I wrote my book is actually because of my son. At the time, I had a 6th grader. He had just gotten a report on a science or a grade on a science report that he was not happy with. So I coached him on how to have that conversation with his teacher and try to understand what he could have done better. He came back the next day from school and I was excited to ask him, how did the conversation go? And he said, well, my teacher told me to email him. And that's when it was kind of like a light bulb moment for me. Oh, this is why I have a lot of managers, or I've dealt with a lot of leaders that don't know how to have difficult conversations because they might not have been given the opportunity to practice. And no shade on that teacher. I am sure he was quite busy, but that was a great opportunity for my son to practice having a difficult conversation in person. And so I really started writing the book with that mentality that I have been given tons of opportunities to develop out these skills. And I'm now understanding that not everybody has been given that opportunity. So, what might development as a leader look like for having some of these conversations? What I consider normal conversations, but apparently are pretty difficult for some individuals.
It's interesting. You might be I don't want to say overexposed, but you might have just exposure to where difficult conversations to you can just feel normal. And I've experienced that myself. Like it doesn't like if you are naturally comfortable, or not naturally, maybe you've just developed the skill to be able to navigate difficult conversations. The conversations don't feel difficult. It sounds weird to say. Maybe it's just obviously intuitive, but I do love the topic of how navigating difficult conversations that motivate and inspire. It almost feels like two sides of a coin. Like you have to balance both, at least in my experience. Like having difficult conversations for me as a leader has just felt like such a deep, almost like the core responsibility of leadership. I'm dealing with vendors and clients and strategic partners and team members. And it's like a majority of where my time is spent is trying to get people to align. And most of the time, alignment's not, I mean, if they aren't naturally already aligned, then it's going to be a difficult conversation. So I love that that is the primary theme of your book because to me, it just feels like such a huge part of what leadership is. And I'd say almost like the primary responsibility is to get alignment through those difficult conversations, but still like preserving motivation and inspiration. Because if you don't have that, then all you're going to do is have a difficult conversation and then things will fall apart. Like, you,
Or you have a difficult conversation and you don't get to the root cause, it's just surface. So we have to have that over and over and over again, which I find a lot of leaders do. When I'm hearing a client say, I've had this conversation with my employee a dozen times, I'm not seeing any change, that's a
right.
red flag to me that, oh, we're having surface level conversations, which oftentimes looks like the leader talking to the employee and the employee sitting there and then we're done. And so there hasn't been any investigation as to the root cause. And so we can't do what most of us are really great at, which is coming up with that creative solution to solve the problem because we
Right.
haven't gotten to what the problem is. And so, yeah, I think that having difficult conversations or being comfortable with them is just like any other muscle. The more that we work it out, the stronger it gets, the less we are fatigued when we utilize it.
I love that that you identify that it feels like some leaders have the same conversation over and over again. I have colleagues that will say the same thing. They enter the conversation believing they have extreme clarity and believing that they've delivered extreme clarity. But I mean, to your point, what you're talking about is intentionally thinking about the person that is receiving the content and whether or not they received it. That's different than inviting somebody to a TED talk so that they can hear what you have to say, which is how I've experienced and how I'm sure many leaders think that's how you're supposed to do it.
Well, even as you're saying that, right? So you're utilizing words like delivering and stating. And to me, that means that again, the end result is going to mean that the person is going to walk away possibly with some more knowledge. But a lot of these conversations could be looked at as root cause analysis conversations, which means me as a leader, I have to go in with curiosity. I have to be really, really clear with what I do know. And a lot of leaders go in knowing a lot that is actually assumptions. We usually don't know too much, right? We usually only know a couple things where there's a lot that we can get curious about. There's a lot of possibilities. And so I find that when I can challenge leaders to go into some of these conversations being the detective, being super curious to try to uncover what's really at play, there's a lot less pressure on them and they do a lot less talking to and more asking questions and talking with the employee. And that's where I see that we can start seeing some actual changes from performance.
I remember also in our previous conversation, you'd mentioned, well, actually, you spotted it in me and said that my style was servant leadership, and that was your style as well, which was it was great. And I've when I think about that, I feel like what you kind of described is it taking that pressure off. It really becomes more of a collaborative experience, and you're looking for the best results from the person that you're working with, not just to spoon feed them that your own set of tasks and expectations. And I had mentioned to you part of I have a couple of assumptions, and maybe I'm wrong. You had said that a lot of times people will assume that their way of doing things is the right way. I actually assume the opposite. I assume that I'm wrong first, and that I'll learn together with that person that I'm collaborating with. Either they already know because I hired them for their expertise or their skill set, like they'll know how to do it better than me, or we'll come up with something because I maybe have more context of what we're trying to do as an organization, but they have more skill in where I need them to help us find the solution that's better for everyone. So for me, it just seems easier if I have to assume anything, just assume I'm wrong first. And then that just forces me to ask questions because I have to find now the right solution, probably collaboratively.
Exactly. Yeah, I think the human brain, when we have missing puzzle pieces, our brain automatically fills those puzzle pieces in. And so to go into any kind of root cause conversation or uncomfortable conversation, we have to get really, really clear as to what is actual pieces of knowledge that we know and what our brain has just kind of plugged into those empty spaces.
You had also mentioned the efficiency of having these conversations, and I'd say maybe even front loading some of this. You'd mentioned that just a little bit ago. You'd mentioned how you have leaders who will say, "I feel like I'm having the same conversation over and over again," and it from my experience, and I think maybe from your description, is it partly because they didn't invest in the full conversation. They just wanted to express their own thoughts and ideas, and then they feel like they have to do it again because they never actually got full alignment. So, like, it almost feels counterintuitive that I have to have this huge, deep, long conversation up front. But I mean, to your point, it feels like that's the investment you make in the alignment, so that you have like infinitely fewer conversations going forward.
A lot less frustration, right? Because if you're doing something that me as an employer does not like and wants you to change, it behooves me as the employer to get to the root cause, even if it does take an hour of conversation between us, because I want you walking away motivated and with a clear action plan. If we have just surface conversations 5 or 6 times, you as the employee will probably at some point get frustrated, demotivated, and disengaged. So it's not just about my time wasting having 18 conversations instead of just one full one, but it's also the impact on you and your engagement. At some point, you're going to disengage. And now
Right.
I'm wasting a lot more than just time on conversations.
You had also mentioned the efficiency of this initial investment, and when I talked to you before, I remember you'd mentioned that you like to also set expectations, even just about how to communicate. Like what you like six. I think you had mentioned that you have like 6 questions that you ask. I didn't ask you at the time what those 6 questions were for setting expectations for communication. Is that something you'd be willing to share? Is that kind of
Yeah.
your secret sauce? I'd love to know what
Nope,
those are.
not secret at all. I This is something that I challenge all of my clients to have a conversation with everybody. Obviously, onboarding is the best time to do that, but we can do it at any point in time and we can actually be vulnerable and utilize it to build trust, right? So, this can sound like, hey, I realize our communication probably isn't the best that it could be. I'd love to kind of fine tune it with you by going through what works for you and what works for me. So, the first question I challenge individuals to utilize is going through feedback. What are your thoughts on feedback? This is my beliefs in feedback. This is how I like to give feedback. This is what I need in terms of receiving feedback. What about you? What do you need for feedback? We all are different, right? I'm somebody who loves a ton of feedback. I'm an athlete in my younger years. And so I just believe that the more feedback I get, the better I'm going to perform. I have definitely worked with individuals that had a different reaction to feedback. So by starting the conversation off by, how do you like feedback and where could we change to make sure that my feedback style is working for you and vice versa is really important. It also then asks the employee to give you, as the employer, feedback. So many of us in leadership aren't great about asking for feedback from those that report to us. And
Right.
setting that expectation that I want you to come to weekly meetings with me with feedback for me could be really, really helpful. So the first one's surrounding feedback. The second is surrounding, how are we going to communicate regularly? Is that a weekly meeting? Is that a bi-weekly meeting? What does that look like and why? A lot of my less senior clients typically complain about meetings. And again,
Okay.
it's perception, right? So I had a client that's like, I'm new to this position, but I'm really frustrated because my supervisor wants to meet with me twice a week. And I just feel like that is a waste of time. Why does she feel like it's a waste of time? Because it wasn't explained to her the why, right? Twice a week for me, for a new employee, doesn't seem like that big of a deal. But that's
Right.
because I'm explaining to them, I want us to understand the way our minds work. I want you to know exactly what I'm thinking. I want to see how you're thinking. But then the cadence of our meetings can wind down as we get to know each other. But just expecting that everybody's going to know why we're going to need to meet as often as we are is usually not going to go well for us. So the cadency of meetings. The next is the agenda. What's your expectation that they show up with for the meeting? Do you want agendas ahead of time? Is that something that is going to be a fixed agenda? Is something going to rotate? What does that look like? I find to be helpful to speak about ahead of time.
Okay. Do you? I know that you've ran this framework by probably multiple clients. Do you find that there's a trend of how they put that together that tends to work better than other ways, or is it really just dependent on the culture and the team, and that's going to be what really determines those decisions in that process?
Yeah, it's different. It depends on the seniority level too, right? I mean, C-suite might not have the same idea or framework that maybe more junior employees would look at, but I think it's having a set of intentional points that we're going to cover so we understand how we're going to communicate. The last 3 points are typically over literally the modes, right? So what modes are we going to utilize to communicate? There's Slack, there's Teams, there's 8
Right.
billion modes. How are we going to utilize those? When do we utilize those? And then email hours, right? I'm somebody who's very, very clear that I don't check my work emails after 6. If I'm working with somebody who has, for some reason, the expectation I'm going to be on my email till 9 and I don't see their email, that could be very frustrating to them. So, again, it's just about making sure that we understand each other and we have clear expectations that we all agree to. As a leader, I'm not telling you what's happening. I'm asking questions so we can come to an agreement that works for both of us.
That makes total sense, and I was actually gonna ask you, given that your style, I'd say, is a servant leadership style. I remember when we were speaking last time, you had mentioned we actually were both talking about how we had, knew of people, and I think you actually had, an example where your organization used an org chart where servant leadership style was actually developed in the org chart, where it actually was, let's just call it like an upside down pyramid, like the leaders were at the bottom serving the top. I To me, that's interesting. I would love to know the thought process behind that. I don't know that people will typically think there's probably lots of people that are aware of it, but I'd love to know your thoughts behind that kind of a structure and how that worked.
Yeah, so the thought process was the happier, the more engaged our team is, the more successful we would be as a business. And oftentimes we had found, and specifically the owners had found, that a typical organizational structure made it so everyone was kind of serving the leader. That
Right.
everybody was communicating in a way that would make the leader happy. Everybody was positioning themselves so that the leader saw them. And that did not feel genuine or authentic to those owners. They really wanted to flip the chart because they wanted the focus to be on the frontline team. The happier our team was, the more engaged they were, the more profitable we would be as a business. The more that we'd all be happy with more raises and benefits was kind of the philosophy. And I saw that play out on a day to day basis. There was nobody that was too good to be dishwashing. There was nobody that was too good to be taking out the garbage. Because again, the thought was if we're helping the frontline staff, if we're making sure they're taken care of, supported, feeling seen, heard, and appreciated, our business was going to thrive. And it was the first time I'd seen it in action to that extent. And all I can say is it gave us nothing but great things. It was truly amazing what happened when you have a team that size fully engaged and be bought into the vision.
How do you mind? How big was the team that was operating under that kind of a model?
So when we started, I mean, it started when I joined. There was 76 employees when I joined that organization, and when I left, there was almost 800.
And it stayed. Then you guys continued to use that model.
We
That's
used it till we
awesome.
sold. Yeah.
So you've had clients, I'd say, in lots of different industries, maybe different size businesses. I
I think
feel
it
like
could
personally
be
it would
used
work.
anywhere.
Okay.
I think that you see it, and again, my world's just sports world, specifically basketball, so that's a lot of my analogies. But if you look at somebody like somebody who just stepped away from coaching, Greg Popovich is a great example. If you hear the stories about him and how he treated his team, the respect that was just felt by everybody in that organization. To me, it was a very much a servant leader philosophy where they weren't there for themselves, they were there for each other. They were serving a bigger purpose and making sure that people were engaged, happy, and safe was the focus. And you see what happens when that is the focus. Championships happens, longevity and sustainability at a really, really high level. And so I do think that you can apply it to any industry. What I think is important is that every leader is embodying it. You can't have one leader embody it and then nine not. and think you're going to get there. It has to be truly
Right.
lived and believed by every leader.
That makes a lot of sense. Actually, I was thinking earlier, a question you had meant we talked about was the idea of Jekyll and Hyde kind of a leader, and you kind of just talked about that now, and kind of like the full body of the leadership, like or in the organization. I was thinking about it in terms of a single leader. So I'm
Mm.
interested in obviously we're trying to figure out how to have difficult conversations, but if we're having difficult conversations to motivate, then you need to be, I'd say the people you're leading have to be able to trust the kind of leader you're going to be and know, you have to set some kind of standard, I'd say, in terms of I need to be able to show up. I need them to be able to count on and be a dependable source of leadership. And what I think that people might confuse that with is it means that I can never show 'em I can never have a moment where I'm vulnerable, and therefore because then it's not reflecting leadership, it's reflecting vulnerability. I think I'd love to know your perspective on what are some signs that I need to look out for, either with how my team reacts to me or just in myself, to avoid being that Jekyll and Hyde leader, and what that could do to your team if you're not being a consistently, I'd say, stable. That was the word I was looking for, a stable leader.
Yeah, consistency in leadership is huge. If our employees don't know what type of leader they're going to get on a daily basis, that's going to cause a lot of anxiety. And people are going to be very, very careful as to what they say at any time. So, intention with leadership, I find to be very, very important. And to your point, that's not to say we're not going to have bad days. There's not going to be times that we're unhealthy, but that intention and having practices and routines that allow us to root in that intention is what's so important. I find that vulnerability attached to intention is where some of the greatest things can come up. So, for me, the quickest way to establish trust is in vulnerability. Now, it's not a one size fits all, right? If I'm going to be vulnerable with an employee, that doesn't mean I'm going to tell them everything about my love life, but it might mean that I'm going to tell them about some of my failures. I'm going to tell them about some of my learnings and how I got that. I'm going to tell them about some of my missteps so that they can understand that I'm not perfect. I've made a load of mistakes. I will continue to make a load of mistakes, but that doesn't mean that we can't learn from these and then overtake other challenges. So I think a combination of intentional leadership combined with vulnerability could be a recipe for an amazing culture. But it does depend on that leader being focused as to how they are going to show up. What I often see is that leaders are reactive. And so that typically means that it falls on their emotional state at that moment. So if a leader comes in and they're really calm, maybe they had a great morning, maybe everything went right that day. And those are typically the times when those leaders are going to ask for feedback and they want people to challenge them. And then maybe they have a couple days of not so great days, and maybe they're really, really stressed and they're not keeping themselves healthy. Then they're gonna come in as a completely different leader, and they might be very, very upset with feedback or might not wanna hear anybody's opinions. And you can see how having that kind of leader show up differently might make the team wonder what in the world's going on and if they're living in the twilight zone and if they who's gonna show up next, right? So I think it's that combination. What I have found is that so many leaders don't give themselves the space to even reflect on what type of a leader do I want to be? How do I want people to feel during or after a conversation with me? And how would I want them to talk about my leadership in 10 years from now? When leaders can start at least there and do a lot of reflecting, typically they come away with an idea of how they want to lead. And then it's about making that routine or putting those steps and practices so they're just constantly aligning with that ideal.
Well, that brings a couple questions to mind. One, does I assume that framework of what kind of leader do I want to be? What do I want to be seen as in 10 years? Are those some of the questions that you try to get your own clients to answer as they're trying to figure out who they want to be as leaders? And is this something that they might be able to themselves kind of start to figure out or navigate as they're reading your book, for example? Is this something that your book goes into as well?
Yeah, it definitely goes into that a little bit. There's also a free workbook on my website that goes along with the book that could be helpful. But yeah, reflection around these main questions, I think, is a great place to start. This is where I start with every client. But understanding What type of leader do they want to be? How do they want people to feel
Right.
during or after a conversation? And that's for all conversations, whether I'm terminating somebody, whether I'm hiring somebody, whether I'm giving feedback. I want to make sure that when I'm in conversation, people feel seen, heard, and appreciated. So I align myself with those ideals. And I think that's a great question for a lot of leaders to ask themselves and see what kind of comes up and maybe how far off that is from how they're showing up on a daily basis right now.
Well, I really appreciate that perspective. I often think about how do I want to be received when I'm having conversations with people, when I think the message really when I care about what I'm doing and I care about who I'm doing it with. That's when I really actually am thinking about how am I being received. And I imagine that's pretty much the core of what a leader should be doing and how they should be thinking. They don't care about the people or the what they're doing. They probably shouldn't be a leader in that space. That would be my guess. I hope that nobody's experiencing that as leaders themselves, and that they really are in spaces that they care about with people they care about. Speaking of, I've really enjoyed this conversation. I care about you. I'm looking forward to reading your book. Thank you for sharing that with us. And on that topic, what do you have on your nightstand now? What are you reading, both professionally for development, as you're obviously a avid reader yourself, but also what do you read in your free time, your fun time?
I've been reading her since I was way too young to be reading her, and so I've gone back and I've started to read her entire series again because 'cause I'm just a nerd like that. So that's what's on my bookshelf right now.
Awesome. Well, Alita, thank you so much for your time. Thanks for joining us on the Lead Smarter podcast. I'm looking forward to having more conversations with you. And again, just thank you for this experience.
Thanks so much for having me.
Hey, thanks for listening to this episode of Lead Smarter. And thank you to the partners and sponsors who believe in our mission to evolve ourselves to elevate others. Speaking of elevating others, if you liked this episode, please be sure to like, follow, subscribe, and share. It would mean a lot to me and the team that works so hard behind the scenes so we can all learn together. And of course, thank you to the expert guests who kindly join us as generous guides on our journey to lead smarter.